Hi everyone, thank you for joining our event Lecture Artist and Book Curation. This event is part of our residency program at the National Institute of Art History in Paris from March to July. Our collective La Lecture Artiste brings together researchers, artists and curators around the question of how artists read, how artists and curators use the books and texts they read. We gather these practices and uses under the name of Lecture Artiste in French. Book curation is an artistic and curatorial practice that consists of putting together a collection of books and exhibiting them. Oscar Salguero and Rachel Walinsky, as book curators, select independent publications from small publishers, artists, activists, and other editorial curiosities, whose assembly opens up oblique reflection, shifts the attentions, and excites the imagination. Today, we want to examine the practice of book curation in order to see how the lecture artist feeds the book curation practices of our guests. We consider that book curation is a form that can take the lecture artist. I wanted to invite Oscar Salguero and Rachel Walinsky to share their book curation practices with us. They will each give a 30-minute talk and then we'll have a discussion. Let's start with Oscar Salguero. He's a researcher, critical designer, and independent book curator based in Brooklyn, where he runs the Anti-Library. His work has been exhibited both nationally and internationally. He curated the exhibition Interspecies Futures at the Center for Book Arts in New York, which is on view until June 26. For our residency, he designed with Bénédicte Toraval modules and bookshelves, and they were made from their design by Judith Espinas. We fill these shelves with books about reading and books belonging to the artists of the collective, making our own book curation. Today, Oscar will present a Zoom version of his book curation entitled "The Book is the Weather," artist book as documents from alternative climate realities. He's going to present a selection of books by artists who are employing the book as a tool for speculation or climate fiction. Oscar, I'll let you speak.
Can you hear me? Just want to make sure that, perfect. All right, so thank you so much, Lison, for and Noemi for the invitation to be part of this fantastic program. Today I'll be talking about the use of artist books as tools for speculation in regards to climate change. So I will present this now, and please let me know if you can see the PDF. So I titled this, "The Book is the Weather," and I created a small description to it. This is a small writing I did about artist books. So I think, and I'm just gonna read it. "The artist book is an anomaly in an atmosphere of publications. It may derive its energy from a place of disturbance, internal or otherwise. Depending on the conditions, it may spread and multiply, or it may quietly disappear, a passing with no commotion. It is not its purpose to engender anything in particular. It doesn't exist to please or to be displeased. Like the weather, it just is, or rather, it has to be. Beyond the nature of its content, its presence is the only story." So this practice that I call the anti-library is something I started very intuitively in the last 5 to 7 years. I don't even remember exactly when. And it just consists in like this kind of understanding I had that these artist books that I kept finding that were so special and so conceptual, to me, they were documents. They were documents that are quite important, representative of what creatives are thinking now. And even if they're coming in editions of 10 or really low editions, they still are documents that are important to archive and to talk about. So the first experiment I really did with this was in early 2020. After living with a cat for less than a year, my wife noticed how I was so interested in like these other species that I was living with. So she challenged me to pick a selection of books related to the topic of interspecies. And this is like the first selection I had. It was 10 books. I used just the living room that that we share here. And it was quite a fascinating exercise because people were able to also participate and tell me what kind of relationship they think these people with animals are having in this particular book or that particular book. Observations from whether the relationship is a collaborative, exploitative, observational, or just a need to become the other animal. So it was an opportunity for me to actually, for the first time, approach the artists and like have an exchange of emails and see what they think, what were their goals or like aspirations with these publications. So, you know, I titled out the Human Non-Human show, created a series of posters, all shared Instagram and just to friends, 10 books on species interactions. This is sort of how it all started. Then so to me, this was a pivotal moment to understand that what I was really getting at was something that I call a pattern recognition exercise. By understanding what these publications seemingly from all over the place, when you start to see a pattern between them, they start to reflect some other kind of exploration from a whole new generation of artists. So what I'm going to really show you now is a mini curation that I call The Book is the Weather. And I'm going to present 4 books that I have physically with me and that I believe represent some of these incredible explorations of potential climate possibilities. So the first one is called Beyond Drifting by Digest Edition 2018. This is made by a photographer. Her name is Mandy Barker from the UK. And it's really a tiny book. And the subtitle is Imperfectly Known Animals. So she studied this older book by a scientist who explored the first microorganisms on the water, like plankton, and started studying them in different photographic plates. So she discovered a series of new species, and in this book, she will show you all of these plates, photographic plates of the different kind of like creatures that she found in a lake near her home. And it's just all quite like beautiful and scientific looking. But at the end of the book, there is a small section called the Index of Specimens. There's a biohazard little sticker. And here's the reveal. It actually is all parts from microplastics that you find in the water. So she really made you believe for the first half of the book that this is about different species that you can find underwater, but in reality, it's just exaggerated macro photographs of parts of plastic or microplastic pieces you can find in the ocean. So presenting new species created from recovered debris serve as a metaphor to the ubiquity of plastic on the Anthropocene, encapsulating in miniature the much larger problem of an imperfect world. So yeah, this is an edition of 600. And also another thing that I find quite interesting is like not only presenting these books as like documents themselves, but also putting them in a context. So around the same time that I found this book, there's this this new saying, scientists engineer plastic eating super enzymes that can break down bottles in days. And then even the photograph, like the person with microscopic lenses, it kind of mimics the art direction that she had for the book. So I just love finding those moments too. The second book I'll present is called A to Z, Coast to Coast, Shore to Shore, published in 2018 by Johan Elmehag from Sweden. Now, this book is actually a thesis project. So one thing that I do with the Entel Library is I not only find books that are available on bookstores or artist websites, but also I am quite interested in what young designers or artists are producing even as their master thesis. So he is a typographer, and in this book, he is exploring a new type of typeface that is inspired by the new type of coastal shore lines that are going to happen around the world when the rising sea levels, continue. I mean, the global sea levels continue to rise across the globe. So based on that, he sort of captures like the outline of these new shorelines and develop an entire typography system. And so the map is based on projections from floodmap.net and the National Geographic research. And you can see here how, like letter A is from a section of the north of Italy. The letter D is from parts of affected countries in former central Borneo. Letter W is from affected countries in the Gulf of Saloum, including Guinea-Bissau, the Gambia, and Senegal. So in a way, this book, which is presented sort of as I guess, an atlas, a world atlas of all of these impending issues happening because of climate change. It's not only just a typographic research, but it's also a critical research into what kind of changes are happening caused by man-made situations. And so here I want to show also another parallel with the news. In the conversation, how many people will migrate due to rising sea levels? Our best guesses aren't good enough, and they're highlighting the coastal Bangladesh, which is one of the letters in his alphabet, the letter I for North India Bay, is already talking about this 3 years before the news came up. The third book I'd like to present is called the In Vitro Meat Cookbook, published in 2014 by Cord van Mensvoort. He's the author, but it actually is from the Next Nature Network, also based in Netherlands. So this is presented as a cookbook, and the entire recipes and the entire the premise is based around the idea of synthetic meat. As we know, gas emissions because of the meat industry are insane, and by 2050, it's there's a part of the book that they say, like, if we were to use in vitro meat, by 2050 it would reduce 98% of gas emissions in that kind of industry. So there's the post-burger, and so back in 2014, right now it's becoming maybe a little bit kind of more popular in the US. You're seeing some like the Impossible Burger and all of these kind of projects that are happening is sort of becoming a little bit more mainstream in the US. But back in 2014 in the Netherlands, this is like completely, like sci-fi. So there's in vitro oysters, meat cocktail. So all sorts of like bizarre new kind of food culture based on what you can do with synthetic meat. And the book actually opens with a really rare quote by Winston Churchill in 1931: "We shall escape the absurdity of growing whole chicken in order to eat the breast or the wing, by growing these parts separately under a suitable medium." So actually, some people consider Churchill to be the sort of the father of this in vitro meat culture or biotech-based food cultures, because he already had this vision. It's quite a strange vision. Yeah, you can do some wacky things, you know, like dinosaur leg, and there's like some of them are quite fantastical and some of them are kind of credible, and I like that line of fiction, non-fiction, where it kind of makes you wonder why not, you know. It's another news I found, you know, world leaders urge to ban all trade in wild animals and birds for eating to prevent pandemics. You know, one thing with COVID-19 is that the main theory is that it's caused because of wet markets in China, in Wuhan, maybe, you know, like wet markets and the trade of wildlife, exotic animals, and this is how it transmitted. The virus transmits from one species into another, and it's consumed by humans. So this idea of continuing a meat industry in some ways is getting back to us, manifested as a virus, you know, that's one way, and in other ways as climate change. So this book that might appear to be kind of like weird and funny in some ways, funky even, it's actually a proposal in some ways, you know. So for me, I take this document seriously, you know. They might appear just quirky or interesting, but I think there's something deeper to them. And the last book from this little collection that I have for you guys, it's called Everybody Needs a Rock, published in 2018 by Sai Honda from Japan. And this is Torch Press, also a Japanese publisher. This is a book made by a jewelry maker. And you see, so Everybody Needs a Rock is inspired by an older book by Bird Baylor from the 70s. It was a children's book, and she's talking about how like the entire book is about teaching kids 10 rules to find the perfect rock. So how to observe rocks in your environment and understand that they are all special and they're unique and they have different smell and different origins. So she takes this kind of premise and creates this fascinating small book. So on the right side, the entire book, she's presenting rocks, these kind of precious rocks, and on the left side, how she found them. So whether she found them in, and even like the coordinates, you know, the latitude, where exactly she found it on Earth, who was walking by, what day. And so the entire book is like that. It's like the experience of how she found the rock, and on the right side, a picture of the rock. What's incredible about this book is that the entire premise is that she's actually invented these rocks. She found pieces of plastic and debris on the streets, and she melted them together to create a new type of rock. And this is a type of rock that is sort of like a representation of the Anthropocene, you know, the era where we have so much influence on the environment that even new formations like rocks can be caused by byproducts of what we create. So every rock I make, this is what she says, I make contains the memories of today, just like diamonds are the result of mental activities during the formation of the earth. And at the end of the book, there's this like a really nice story about how, you know, she connects this in a poetic way with what these plastic pieces mean in the future. And yeah, here's a little reveal of the parts that she found. And I am not sure if you guys have heard, saw the news a couple years ago that in Hawaii, they're actually finding rocks naturally made by the erosion of like plastic debris in the ocean. And so they call these plastic glomerates. So you see, like, even so this kind of context makes that book a lot more fascinating. You know, it's also a representation of our this time that we're living in. So these are the 4 books. Yeah, this is one more shot of the book. Is quite small. And to me, these books are created, you know, in the last 4, 5, 6 years, but they are extrapolating, you know, there are opportunities to extrapolate our influence on our own environment and our own climate. And some of them like sort of present ideas that might be more visible or more obvious in 5 years, 10 years, maybe even decades into the future. And this small study, yeah, you can see here on the left side, yeah, the left side is one book that I'm using in our interspecies futures. So this time I'm focusing on the last 4 books. So to me, for example, the first one I show you is sort of like the archetype of a science book, right? It's presented as a scientific book with plates of the species and the Latin name of each species. The second one is presented as a world atlas. You know, there is a large map that comes with it and going region by region around the world and talking about the rising sea levels. The third one is presented as a cookbook where you can find this, it's designed to feel and look like a normal cookbook that you see in people's kitchens. And the fourth one as a sort of a mineralogical encyclopedia. And so these documents themselves represent larger concepts to me. The first one represents this oceanic pollution. The second one represents rising sea levels globally. The third one represents this kind of new alternatives with biotechnology and lab-grown meat. And the fourth one, the Anthropocene, you know, sort of a mark or a physical object that represents this era where humans have complete effect on the environment. So these are the 4 books. I have them all here. If anyone later wants to see like just some more details, you know, this, for example, is the meat cookbook. I don't know if you guys can see me on the screen. There's like weird stuff like knitted meat, origami meat. And there's even like a rating. There's ratings of each recipe right at the top. This one is meat powder. So I'll stand up a little bit more. I'll show you another one. This is the first one that I presented, Perfectly Known Animals. So here is like the plates. What's beautiful too is that in the Latin names that she chooses for each species, later in the book it reveals that the word plastic is presented in different letters. So it's sort of like anagrams of the word plastic. And here's the last section where is the reveal of the origin of this supposed species. This is the atlas. So it's actually a large poster. That's great. Yeah, I don't think you can see it right now, but just believe it. And then the small one. The jewelry book. So I want to end this part of the conversation by just showing you what's next for this larger project that I consider the anti-library. So right now, at this moment, at the Center for Book Arts in New York, I'm presenting a 2-year-long study that I call Interspecies Futures. Interspecies Futures is a continuation of the real first show that I presented to you, that I did in my apartment, about books about animals and humans. This one in particular is focused on speculative and fictional proposals for the future of humans and other species. So they're quite almost between sci-fi and realistic. It's quite interesting. So here's the main presentation at the Center for Book Arts, and it's divided by books created between 2017 and 2019 on the larger table, kind of in the back, and the table that's closer to us in here in this picture is presenting 6 books that I commissioned for the show by young artists and young practices. So this presentation is basically of books from the last 5 years that are talking, that are doing this kind of like proposals, inspired by many things that have been going on, namely, as I say, in climate change, the effects of our actions into other species. You know, like we see a lot of wildfires in the last couple of years, increasing in numbers. We see the effects of biotechnology and how we are affecting other organisms. Someone like Elon Musk using pigs to implant Neuralink chips into their brains, or try to put chips in the brains of monkeys to play video games. You know, all of these crazy things that are happening are sort of inspiring this new wave of artists also to create new proposals, how to tackle these new dilemmas. So yes, here's another sort of view of the presentation. If you guys are in New York, I highly encourage you to see them in person, because they're all really tactile, all conceptual. The format that they adopted are completely conceptual. Like some of them are like investigative dossiers, some of them are look like encyclopedia, like scientific journals, like field guides, records, and so on. There's even a few artifacts that were sent by the artists to sort of like increase the suspension of disbelief. That one right there is supposedly a dodo egg, an egg from a dodo that has been there's a de-extinct animal that can exist as a pet in the future. And it was also an opportunity to introduce this concept of the interspecies library, which is the what I consider like a first kind of archive dedicated to preservation and curation and also advancement of this type of books. And then finally, I just show you quickly, these are some of the books that I commissioned for the show. This is the Pink Chicken Project, the Signal Crayfish by Christopher Oram from Denmark, Non-Flowers, like an alternative synthetic lure for pollinators, by Thomas Frost from Iceland, and Hotel Symbiogenesis by Hypothetical Studios. So all of these books are present in the show. It's up there for 3 more weeks. And yes, they represent sort of this another experiment of this larger idea that I have and that I call the anti-library. So thank you so much for your time. And you can follow at _, it's missing there, anti-library in Instagram. You're mute, Lison.
Yeah, sorry. So I was saying thank you very much. And we can say that you will make a book review of Signal Crayfish by Christopher Orum on during our study days at the Institute of National Art on July 5th. We will now listen to Rachel Walinsky. She's a writer, editor, curator based in New York and Paris. Her writing has appeared in Art in America, Art Agenda, Art Forum, Frieze, Bomb Magazine, Millennium Film Journal, and elsewhere. And she is a contributing editor at Primary Information and Edition Lutany. She has curated exhibitions, performances, and public programs in numerous art spaces. She's a co-founder of Wendy's Library, and she's also artistic director of the library in Brooklyn. And she's a doctoral candidate in art history at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. She will tell us about the reading room at Wendy's Subway, which is a rotating collection of publication from small local and international publishers, artist projects, activists, archive, and community organizations. She will focus on collective and collaborative practices of creating and disseminating independent publication, and will consider independent publishing as an essential tool to inform our collective imagination for a radically better future. Rachel, it's your turn.
Great. Thank you, Lison and the Collectif for the invitation to speak today. And thanks, Pascal, for your great talk. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully that is visible. Okay. I'm speaking from Wendy's Subway, which is a nonprofit reading room, writing space, and independent publisher based in Brooklyn. And since our founding in 2013, we've tried to provide an open and versatile platform for expanding modes of reading, writing, and publishing. And we host an interdisciplinary program, including free readings, talks, performances, writing groups, workshops. But we also publish books, and beginning in 2015, we also started a project called The Reading Room, which is what I'm going to be primarily focusing on today. And so this talk kind of looks at some of our recent reading room projects and also considers other recent artists' projects at the intersection of publishing, book curation, reading rooms, and exhibitions to think about collective practice, alternate institutional frameworks, and independent and collective forms of organizing around art making, archiving, and publishing. So this is Wendy's Subway. We were founded in 2013 by a group of writers, primarily as a space for writing and as a kind of collective structure. And in 2016, we moved to a new location on Bushwick Avenue in Brooklyn, where the question of the space's mission and its kind of public mission came to the fore. We asked questions like, what does access to a public collection mean, and what kinds of programs can really expand and extend that mission, and how do we reach audiences, what kinds of resources we can offer as a library space. We have a library collection of nearly 4,000 titles at Wendy's Subway, which are primarily artist books, independent publishers, poetry chapbooks, and so I guess to sort of introduce the Reading Room project, I want to go back a little bit and trace a little bit of the network of influence and collaboration that contributed to founding the space and to kind of initial ideas about what the potential of publishing sort of viewed on a wide spectrum can be. When we started, we felt like there weren't a lot of spaces like this that sort of offered you know, an on-site reading room, but also had this programmatic interest in thinking about the kind of life of the book more broadly. And so we were looking at a lot of other spaces, both historically, alternative art spaces, but then also contemporary examples of like-minded projects that were relevant. And we started this kind of digital archive of library projects, sort of independent and alternative library projects of very different scales, some of which housed in institutions, some of which popping up on you know, the stoop of a building every Saturday, some of which operating out of somebody's home. Many of these just kind of we found out about because someone would tell us about them sort of through word of mouth. But we started this kind of archive called All the Libraries to sort of catalog and document these projects that were really influential to thinking about different models of library structures, but then also how artists and specifically kind of artistic practices could be informing the ways that these libraries functioned. And so I'm just going to run through a couple examples of things that were particularly meaningful at the time and that continue to really inform our thinking. This was a series of publications put out by Castillo Corrales, which is now a number of different things, Paraguay Press, a publisher, and After 8 Books in Paris, which is a bookstore. And Castillo Corrales was a cooperatively run nonprofit contemporary art venue that had an exhibition space, a bookstore, and a publishing house. And they published this series of pamphlets called Slob, The Social Life of the Book. And this notion of the social life of the book really became a kind of motto for us around, you know, these are all texts that were commissioned to think about the kind of circulation of ideas and agency of publications to sort of produce new relationships, to assemble new publics, and to kind of think about this kind of ecosystem of publishing and writing. And so thinking about that and also the distribution of books has been really important for us. And I'm talking about like books, but then also kind of structures that house books like libraries, because I think there's a lot of connection in the kind of strategies that people are developing to build both publications and reading rooms. And a kind of extension of this idea of the social life of the book was a project that that Castillo Corrales also organized with an artist, Katinka Bach, at Béton Salon in Paris. And this project was a kind of open invitation. So Katinka Bach made 100 small sculptures that were kind of scattered around the exhibition space and invited people to take those sculptures with the idea that they could then also purchase a book for the library in exchange. So kind of opening up this porous structure for exchange and for the kind of growth of the library or of the bookstore. And also thinking about these kind of microeconomies of how libraries function. The institution hosted this library of books, but which could be borrowed for different periods of time, whether for an afternoon or several years. So also kind of the afterlife of a loan is something that I think maybe we can think about as well. And then just another example was this book called Book About, which was the result of a conference that gathered all these different sort of themes around publication, whether that's the kind of economics or pragmatics of publishing and distributing books today, or the kind of social spaces of reading, or practices of bootlegging or scanning or quoting or editing, all of these kinds of gestures that and spaces that house this like spectrum of the social life of the book and of its activation, again, are kind of informing some of the work that we were doing at the very beginning of Wendy Subway. So all of these questions kind of come into the formation of the library, and thinking about the library as a space of hospitality was also very important for us, and thinking about cataloging specifically as a hospitable and kind of open possibility. I'm just showing you here. This is an essay by David Senior, who's a librarian, head librarian at the San Francisco Museum of Art Library. And he's writing here about the Indian mathematician and librarian S.R. Ranganathan and the 5 laws of library science from 1931. And kind of repeating this motto of books are for use, every reader their book, every book its reader. Save the time of the user, the library is a growing organism. So again, these kind of pillars or laws that we like to abide by or think about in constituting a library. I'm going to pivot a little bit to these reading rooms that we developed in 2015. We started this reading room project installing temporary collections housed within specific institutions on an invitation to develop a collection that was kind of speaking to a particular exhibition, theme, or program. And the first reading room we developed was in 2015 at Brown University. We had the opportunity to work with designers to kind of imagine what the structure that would hold these collections could be. And there were some really incredible proposals around just how to configure seating and shelving such that it could be accessible, but also could invite different ways of viewing and engaging with books. Lots of different proposals. And in the end, we ended up with this proposal, which became the kind of like modular furniture from which all of our reading rooms were based. This is a library carrel. You can see that you can engage with it like you would in a library, but you can also turn this structure around and use it as a seat, or turn it around again and use it as a kind of tabletop. So this kind of modular, flexible structure became our architecture. And we installed the Wendy Subway reading room for an exhibition that was dealing with kind of digital poetics, experimental writing, and sort of concrete poetry, an exhibition called From Line to Constellation. And from there, we had a number of installations. I won't go into all of them in great detail, but we installed the reading room at a conference called Open Engagement in Pittsburgh that was thinking about place and revolution. And each time we assembled a collection of books that was from our library that sort of spoke to these themes, but then we also invited speakers in this conference to suggest titles that were relevant to their own practices and informing their own work and thinking around this idea of place and revolution. In 2015, we also installed a reading room at the NADA Art Fair. And this was a collaboration with Aeromoto, a space in Mexico City that was a library that we discovered sort of like 2 weeks after they opened, and with a specific focus on artist books, periodicals, and exhibition catalogs by Latin American publishers. And this was a really amazing initiative, which is still open, brought together by four people: curators, designers, artists, editors, who sort of pooled their personal collections together and turned that into a publicly available library, with the goal of making these books that are typically only accessible if you have some kind of institutional affiliation to a university or otherwise, making those books available to anyone who would want to consult them. So we worked with Eromoto to kind of pair our collections. They sent us 25 books and we paired them with 25 books from our collection. And then we invited 50 artists and writers to respond to the catalog and created these pamphlets that you can see kind of in the upper right corner here, which were individual artist books with each of these artists' responses. And ultimately, this is Eromoto in Mexico City. And ultimately, we published a book, a bilingual publication that has all of these contributions collected. So this was kind of the first occasion that we had to really think about the library as a space also to invite other libraries to kind of show their titles and sort of circulate books beyond the confines of their own kind of geographies and audiences. Just moving forward, we had a number of reading rooms at a space called the Brooklyn Academy of Music, BAM in Brooklyn, on the occasion of this festival called the Next Wave Festival, which occupies all of the theaters at BAM and is their kind of fall festival for new performance, choreography, theater, music, etc., and literary programs. And so we use this as an opportunity to create a kind of reference library around performance and all of these time-based fields and movement-based fields. And then we also worked with all the artists who were exhibiting or who were presenting new work in the theaters to also show their, again, to kind of show their own books from their own collections that were influential to their practices as time-based artists. We worked again with the same designers to create these book forms that would invite different ways of reading and engaging with publications. Each of the book forms sort of hosted a book in a different way or hid a book in a different way. And so we were trying to activate different ways of engaging with the publication on a really physical level, right? That sometimes you would open a book or you would stumble on a book that was already open at a specific page, or you could sort of deal with a stack of books or have to find out what they were, you know, based on their kind of orientation and the pairings that we created to sort of have them speak to each other. And for each of these reading rooms, we also published catalogs that include the kind of full list of publications in the reading room. In 2017, we installed a second library at BAM for the next year. And this was really the first time that we brought this idea of all the libraries into conversation with the reading room and sort of expanded the confines of how we have been thinking about the reading room. We, again, kind of invited Next Wave artists to submit titles from their own collections, but here what was really central to this reading room collection was a sort of rotating installation of titles recommended by 25 international independent and artist-run libraries and organizations around the world who suggested titles that dealt with performance in some way. So again, kind of presenting this resource library on performance, but entirely assembled from other libraries. And this was a way to kind of share resources and references and forms of knowledge around across different publics to also let people know, you know, this is the collection that Chimurenga has, or this is part of the collection that Eromoto has, or this is part of the collection that you know, Ulysses has, or any number of libraries that we worked with for this project. And so I just want to highlight a few of these libraries, which have collections that are sometimes formed in a very interesting way. Not all of these are library projects, but for instance, Press, which is based in Baltimore and in Los Angeles, they opened in 2014, and they have a publishing practice that's organized around deepening the understanding of voices, identities, and narratives that have been suppressed or misrepresented by the mainstream, and focusing specifically on immigration and race in the United States. And then also building networks of relationships through publishing practices that are centered on self-representation and gathering. And so they did this through their programming, but then also through their studio practice in Baltimore and a library that was available in their Baltimore studio. We had also invited Ulysses, which is a bookshop in Philadelphia, which is, I think, currently in the process of reopening in a new space. And this is a bookstore, but it's a bookstore that's really informed by these ideas around publishing as artistic practice, and around a kind of curatorial vision around how the bookstore kind of rotates its collection. Ulysses is a reference to Ulises Carrión, the Mexican-born poet, conceptualist, and avant-garde artist who was an early pioneer and theorist of artist books, and the founder in Amsterdam of a bookstore called Other Books and So that was open from 1975 to 78. And that was a really important center for kind of transnational dialogue, for male art networks, and a meeting place for artists and writers. And so here we have this kind of way in which the bookstore also serves as a distribution center, serves as a kind of archive as well of these relationships of the kind of social life and movement of books. Ulysses being a kind of reference to them as well, and picking up that practice in the present. And this, I wanted to just highlight as a digression, a book project that takes up Ulises Carrión's work. This is a book published by Ediciones Hungría in Mexico City. In 75, Carrión wrote a manifesto called The New Art of Making Books, El Arte Nuevo de Hacer Libros, which is now quite famous. And he announces the kind of death of the book in this manifesto as an integral part of its new production. So he talks about the book as a kind of autonomous and self-sufficient form, and says that the book artist was not an author who writes a text that will be laid out by the servants, the artisans, the workers, and others in a lesser position within a hierarchy, but rather someone who makes books and assumes the responsibility for the whole process. So an artist is someone who's developing a book, but then also printing it, circulating it, and sort of taking the reins on that entire ecosystem. And this is a publication. The book consists, Ediciones Hungría's book consists of this book jacket, which features the manifesto on the inside, but is wrapped around any number of books that they sourced in the process of producing this edition. And so it really takes up Carrión's idea that the book and its circulation are, they're part of this kind of economy of circulation, and the book can be really anything, including here simply a book jacket. And so thinking about that, there were other projects that were part of the reading room in 2017 that were kind of relevant to this idea. The Surplus Library, which is a library run by Berlin-based artist Antonia Hirsch. It's a collection of books that's entirely kind of relevant to the topic of affect and economic exchange. The collection is sort of idiosyncratically assembled from her own collection, but then also from loans by other people. And in order to, and it's really thinking about kind of non-monetary exchange. And so to loan a book, you really have to contact the person who owns that book and sort of get it from them directly. But then we also were thinking about, so, this is an example of an artist-run library project that's quite sort of specific in its mission. But then also we were thinking about artist archives and how that manifests and sort of relates to publishing. And so here's an example of an artist archive that has a really exciting model. It's the Los Angeles Contemporary Archive, which is an artist-run archive and non-circulating library with a focus on archiving the creative processes of contemporary artists. So we might think of an archive as something that is, you know, focused on the past and on preserving the past. And here they're asking questions directly of artists to ask them to think about what practices they have currently and how they can document and disseminate those practices in the present and also looking into the future. And then other projects that we were, that have an entirely digital existence for the time being. For instance, Reading Zimbabwe, which is another library that we included in the reading room and which also did a residency at Wendy's Subway. And this is an independent, not-for-profit digital platform that was founded in 2016 to discover and celebrate Zimbabwean literatures and to place them before a very large audience, specifically with the idea that so much Zimbabwean literature has been exported to other countries but is not available in Zimbabwe. And so that this archive serves as a resource, as a bibliography in a way, and also as an opportunity to start to gather these publications to create a physical people's library in Zimbabwe eventually. So these are some of the projects that we highlighted in that reading room, and really as a way to think about the library and all the ways that the library can host other libraries, many of which are artist run. I just wanted to mention a few other projects that have, you know, that are run by artists that have emerged in the past couple of years. This is a project by Stephanie Jemison and Jamal Cyrus called Alpha's Bet Is Not Over Yet. It was an installation at the New Museum in New York in 2011. And it's a discussion space, a reading room, and exhibition space inspired by the energy and politics of radical independent Black periodicals published during the first half of the 20th century. And the centerpiece of this collection is kind of interactive newsstand that features complete reproductions of more than 500 issues of Black periodicals that were published between 1902 and 1940. So these are kind of facsimile reproductions of these newspapers, periodicals, magazines, making them available again all together as a way to kind of spur conversation and reading in this space. Another project by the artist Martine Sims. This is called The Queen's English, and it was an exhibition and library and sort of related to her ongoing publishing practice, to think about ways that, to think about the kind of distribution of information within Black feminist communities in the 1970s. So this is a collection that's specifically focused on Black feminist praxis and publications emerging during that decade, and sort of how intergenerational dialogue can be produced through even the presentation of these books altogether. And then very recently, this is a new project space by the artist and curator Tiona Nakia McLeodin that's called Conceptual Fade. It opened in February 2021 in Philadelphia. And it's a very small, it's 135 square foot gallery that hosts micro exhibitions, as well as a library constituted by one single artist's work for the exhibition, and then supported by sort of reference works and materials that are related to the development of that practice. And Tiona talks about this space as taking inspiration from the Philadelphia-based Pyramid Club, which was founded in 1937, and which she writes is an all-Black led and operated organization and private social club located in the north of Philadelphia. The Pyramid Club held an annual art exhibition in its salon space with a goal of connecting featured Black artists to local Black patrons and communities. So I'm just kind of bringing these together because I want to think more generally about kind of structures that hold books and then artists that produce those structures. I guess by way of conclusion, I wanted to think also about this idea of collective imagination, something that's brought up by even these installations that are imagining kind of intergenerational dialogue, a kind of history returning. By concluding, I just want to bring up the last reading room that we did, which was called the People Studio, or which was installed at the Museum of Modern Art at MoMA in New York. It's called the People Studio. And this exhibition of books, which was a rotating collection, was meant to kind of amplify and expand the topics and thematics and practices of artists whose work was on view in the museum galleries that had just been reinstalled for the reopening of the museum, which had undergone a sort of expansion and renovation. And so for this collection, we really wanted to focus on titles that were solicited from or made by or published by local and international small presses, artist-run projects, and community archives and organizations, but really emphasizing books that had been produced through a kind of collective or collaborative practice, and also that were really consciously thinking about their own circulation and distribution. And so we did this in a couple of ways, through this kind of research to sort of match, in a way, works that are in the collection with contemporary artist books that are kind of speaking to similar ideas, whether that's, in the case of, I Want a President transcript of a rally. This was a series of talks and lectures and performances that were given on the High Line in New York following the election of Donald Trump. Or in the center here, If I Ruled the World. This was a project by Press, which I mentioned earlier, that was inviting kind of high school students to think about what they would do if they were sort of in charge, right? Like how they would wield their power as leaders. Or in this case, publishing zines for prisoners. This is an interview with a prison inmate and also an artist who has a very active drawing practice, which was sort of documented in this interview, and so on and so forth. So these were some of the books that we had in the collection. And then we also had an open call to invite viewers to the collection to think about, to sort of contribute to a reader, which was both an online and on-site publication that asked people to send in, excerpts from publications in their own collections that made them think about this idea of collective imagination. Okay, sorry, I think I'm going on for a little bit, but I will just close with this last project, which developed during the pandemic. And this is a project called Publishing the Present, an archive of mutual care and action. In many ways, it comes out of the questions that we asked ourselves with the MoMA reading room around collective artist practice and publishing and activism. This was initially supposed to be a reading room installed at the Emily Carr University of Art and Design in Vancouver, Canada. But because of the pandemic, it became a digital project. And this is an archive. You can consult it, and I'll put the link in the chat in a moment. This is an archive that was developed to document publications produced in the kind of moment of international urgency and kind of global uprising last summer, but more generally in 2020. And also that year is sort of an arbitrary cutoff given the state of the world in general. But specifically, we wanted to think about this archive as a kind of incomplete document of the present that attests to ongoing histories of struggle for justice and the current global crisis, which informed the kind of collective imagination of, how to deal with both the public health crisis, social justice struggles, the pandemic, et cetera, et cetera. So what we published, we published this archive, this digital archive, which documents independent publications, zines, even digital projects that came out, that sort of cropped up and were published in 2020, and tried to center the work of independent publishers to document how these creative networks produced and disseminated urgent, nuanced, and collective responses that contribute to socio-political change on a local and on an international scale. And we wanted to map through this archive the movement between the kind of intersections between social movements, activist efforts, emergency responses, mutual aid, protest, social unrest, et cetera, and think about the role of artists, activists, and publishers within that kind of nexus. I think I'll end there, but hopefully that wasn't too all over the place, but yeah, those are just some examples of recent projects, and also trying to bring in contemporary artists who are also thinking about the kind of library as a form for their own practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. It was very rich and inspiring. Thank you for sharing all of these projects. We can ask questions now. So if you want to ask questions, you can write them down by clicking on the Q&R, or you can click on the little hand to raise your hand if you want to speak up. I will start with the first question for both of you. To me, your practice of book creation is a form of lecture artist, which is characterized by the fact that you make use of books as a set. Each of your projects results in an assembly, a set of books that you put forward, that you make visible by a large audience. And each book is enriched by the proximity of other books. What interests you about gathering books around a topic, a theme, a political issue, and so on? Rachel, maybe you want to start?
Oh, sure. I think, I mean, there's lots of things that interest me about that practice, but I think one of the most significant ones is the way in which pooling resources and sort of knowledges can happen through this kind of curation. And so when I'm describing these projects, they're always collectively assembled, and they always kind of begin with, you know, a group of 5 or 6 people sitting around a table looking at the kind of themes that we're trying to respond to, or the practices we're trying to respond to, and drawing from each of, you know, our backgrounds and knowledges and interests to start to reach out to larger and larger kind of audiences. And I think that's I think that kind of collective thinking around collection building is really exciting. I mean, I think it has the potential to really open up, you know, the kind of practice that and the kind of possibilities for research that are that exist around putting all that knowledge and all these publications together. So that's kind of on the end of like making the collection, but then I think also building these kinds of collections is a way to it's a way to make resources available to readers, and a way to kind of bring these more or less idiosyncratic research strands or modes of thinking or possibilities for conversation into a public sphere, you know. And I think so the kind of collective practice that can happen both in building these collections and in their reception, I think, is really powerful.
Yeah. And Oscar, you don't make this work with other people, you do it yourself. So how does it go? How does it go?
Yeah, I start out of curiosity usually. I'm really following like forecasting trends. Oops, am I disappearing?
Yes.
I am very interested in like sort of like subjects that are under the radar and that are going to become more mainstream or popular in like 3, 4, 5, 10 years. And so what I do is, in my case, I investigate artists or even students. You know, I have a lot of projects that are student master theses that are maybe created not for a larger audience, maybe even just for their class. So a lot of these books that I'm researching, they're maybe not even designed for us, like, or even like created for us to read them or access them. Not maybe intentionally, but maybe because of the lack of resources. So what I do is I try to find them. I just try to see what's happening, where they're coming from, and put them together and create a larger thesis. That, to me, the existence of these books, the fact that they're created, that someone was compelled and passionate enough about the subject to make it into a book, you know, into an artifact, that even to me is the statement. So I gather them and then I present a larger thesis. Like this interspecies one, for example, means that a lot of these artists didn't know each other for the first, you know, one just graduated, one is still working on their graduation project. There's another one that's like more established internationally, but they didn't know each other. So I realized that they're ultimately working on the same kind of consciousness plane, which is what is our relationship with other animals in such a strange time, you know, in terms of like biotechnology, climate change, and all of these issues. So they're arriving at not similar, but like conclusions that can be part of a larger thesis or project. So that's what I do in my case. And so I'm kind of like, I'm investigating their presence, their existence by myself in this case, and then presenting them publicly. So presenting them for a larger sort of like, I want to see what the public says, you know, because they're so obscure, but to me, they're so important. Yeah.
And what are the feedbacks of the audience?
Feedbacks is a lot of fascinating. Many people that are coming are not from the design background. They're not from biotech background. In fact, a lot of them like maybe finance, I don't know, like data design, art, not necessarily from these areas. So they're all of them find a favorite one. Some of them have offended by some of the solutions. Ultimately, all of them are surprised by these kind of ideas. Like they don't know that our level of manipulation of organisms is that advanced, and that some of these proposals could actually happen. They're not aware. So even just creating that awareness of these new possibilities, good or bad, it's good. It's a positive thing, I think.
Yes. Rachel, you talked about how the work to make these reading rooms and your projects at Wendy Subways are collective, but can you tell us a little bit more about your methods? How do you search for books? What are your criteria? What is your research method? And when do you know when to end the research? Because you can, most of the time, I guess you can always add more books. And when you decide that it's over and the project is done and the catalog is over?
That's a really good question. I mean, there's some pragmatic choices. For instance, you know, when you're working with a space and you're developing the architecture and that sort of housing for a library, you're going to have a capacity question that you have to deal with, you know, and so often we're working with designers early on in the process of developing the structure for the library, so that we know, okay, this is really best suited to house 100 books, or this space is best suited to house 50 books, or so we kind of work backwards from there. And then often we begin with a very large selection of titles and start to whittle it down. But it really depends on the project, I would say. I mean, I think the research methods they really vary depending on the project. And because the reading rooms have been responsive to certain venues or exhibitions or programs, we find ourselves often, there are correspondences that happen very quickly. So for instance, at MoMA, we were responding to different gallery sort of clusters or constellations of ideas that were outlined for us in the checklists and in the kind of thematic description of each room. So one gallery, for instance, was focusing on, mail art networks, and another gallery was focusing on 1970s downtown New York or something like that. And so from there, we'll build, we'll do sort of focused research on those themes and then start to pare down depending on our criteria, which in this case, we're really trying to highlight books that were not single authored, books that were really resulting from a collective practice of some kind, or documenting a collective practice, or that in and of themselves engage with the notions of circulation, distribution, and dissemination in an active, intentional way, or were representative of a kind of alternate system of distribution that they themselves partook in because of, their own kind of the network of publishing that they exist in. So, so that was one example. But then, for publishing the present, for instance, we did a lot of research on Instagram, because zines and sort of mutual aid publications, like things that were coming out in 2020 were being circulated very actively online through social media, even if they were printed publications. Often part of the effort of disseminating the resources that were included in those kind of activist publications was to put PDFs online or to share them on social media. And so we spent a lot of time on Instagram, kind of following the rabbit hole of one kind of activist group's publications and referencing to other places. And then also, it's really important to note that there are hubs for this work. So if you think about something like Other Books and So in the 70s, that's where you would have gone to find artist books of a certain kind. And we certainly have, colleagues and references and spaces like that are important always to look to, whether that's printed matter here in New York or other digital archives that we're looking at because they're very actively kind of collecting material that's of interest. So yeah, but I would say all of that sounds very organized, but it is a chaotic process, and it's a process that's very personal in a way, and it's very much based on relationships and the kinds of knowledges that we're all developing individually and that are being reinforced by the sort of network that Wendy's has grown and developed over the past 7 years. So
I actually agree. Yeah, I agree with the personal part because, and also the Instagram part. I have found so many of these artists through Instagram, and I developed a sort of relationship with them. I started talking to them, and a lot of them, when I find out about their work, maybe they have 500 followers, 300 followers. They're just it's a project that's so personal for them that it's irrelevant the amount of followers, but they're doing something special. As a curator, I know I'm sure, Rachel, you also see when there's something special, regardless of what kind of impact it has at the moment that you found out about the work. And so I definitely believe in that that relationship, the creation of a dialogue, because ultimately you're trying to also find a new outlet for their work, present their work in a new way, and they also need to trust that that what you're doing with their work amplifies and enriches their work itself. I think that's for me has been really the way I've been doing it. Yeah.
Yes, I had a question about the outlet, because your book curation and your reading rooms are made to make people read books, and by making people discover them as Oscar did in his speech and made them to, you want to make them to read that, to make them want to read them. And but also to you make them available for reading in your reading rooms. You pay attention to the way of the books are presented to the visitor's path, to the design of the space, as you showed in your both in your presentations. How does this work go with the designers? What determines your choices about the design, the visitor's path, etc. Maybe Oscar, you want to speak about what you did with the interspecies futures, for example?
Yeah, for example, in that case, it was kind of a collaboration with my wife, Benedict, because she has a lot more also understanding of the exhibition space and a spatial distribution of a arrangement in a spatial context. And ultimately, it was decided that in that case, it would be interesting to present it as two tables, two large tables open, and for everyone to come in and interact with the books. Because it could have easily been a choice where like they were very precious and all behind glass, but it was deliberate decision to make them, available. And so the two tables, basically, one of them represents books from a certain era published before the pandemic year, between 2017 and 2019. And the other table is presenting books after pandemic, so post-pandemic, all published in 2021, commissioned in 2020, and published in 2021. So in that case, like that is kind of the conceptual arrangement in the case of this show. But I believe, and then there's also, I have the Interspecies Library, which is just a large, a long sort of like reading shelf, again, accessible for people to come in and browse through all of these collection. And yeah, and then there's also the text in the wall with description of what the library could be by some of the artists invited to the show. But I believe, Rachel, obviously with her reading rooms, this is like a key element of your work, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, the design is so central to how a reader will experience the space, how the books are displayed, and also what relationship to the books is being sort of promoted or facilitated. I mean, I think a lot about some early conversations we had with our designers who made the carols. And when we were kind of reworking the design at BAM, we were trying to think about, the difference between generating a space that feels like a kind of browsable retail environment. So because books are also, exist in retail environments, the idea of the study and how to, how a table can do that instead of selling books, and then, or the library and the carol and that kind of individualized experience. And so, so the book forms and the specific arrangement of books on a table, or whether books are spine out or face out or, looking up at you or whatever, all of that really has an impact on how accessible the book feels, how easy it is to pick it up, whether you feel as a reader like you're going to put it back in the wrong place and you're going to mess something up, or whether you actually feel like you can use it. And that kind of goes back to the sort of David Senior quote, or, books are for use. The library is not purely a space of preservation, it's a space of use, right? Like in the sense that we don't preserve anything unless we use it and transmit that knowledge over time. Otherwise, we're just preserving objects, right? So, so I think that's been really central to thinking about, and obviously questions of access, and in many other ways, like in terms of wheelchair access, and in terms of like, physically how someone can orient themselves around the space. and then also how access can be thought of digitally as well. So, so all these questions are really central to the kind of architectural and design thinking that goes into the reading room, and in fact it does really affect sometimes the selection of books. Like the MoMA collection, you know, is the books are standing up, and that in a way is like not a great thing to do for books over a long period of time, because they get damaged if they stand up like that. And so we needed to figure out a system for them to lean. So it's a lot about like support structures to hold, you know, and I think that's a nice concept also to imagine more generally how design and architecture served as a sort of support or care structure for these practices, rather than simply like an accessory to their presentation, you know.
You know, one thing also that I really enjoy about the reading rooms and also like this kind of presentation is that you cannot quantify at the end of the day the kind of influence or the kind of impact it has on people. It's unquantifiable, right? And also like when people come in, they have an effect, an organic effect on the books, like because they are like rearrange them in a strange way or create new connections that you couldn't imagine. And so I really love that about the physical presentation of books. In a sense also something that for me is like extremely important about these documents, like as physical objects, is that once they're printed, they're already escaping like a tagging, you know, like a digital tagging, like a digital tracing, you know, and they're just out there, you know, they're like really you don't know, like nobody knows what you read, nobody knows what part you read. It just stays with you, and it's all completely organic. And I think that's absolutely the value of like these physical spaces.
Okay, thank you both very much. That was very interesting and inspiring. This is the end of our discussion, but I hope we can follow our this discussion and these reflections about book curation and reading rooms and the selection of books. So thank you very much again for being here and for this very interesting presentations and this discussion.
Thank you, Lisanne. Thanks,
Yeah.
Rachel.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.